This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Mussolini is dead, and a howling mob in Milan, where fascism was born, provides the sordid finale as it attempts to vent its rage on the body of Sawdust Caesar and his followers, executed a short time before by Italian partisans after a summary trial. Signal Corps cameras record the blind fury of a people whom he led to disaster after promising them an empire through 20 strutting and corrupt years. The final degradation, Mussolini and his mistress hang from the rafters of a gas station as Taracci, one of his hangmen, goes up. There are none to mourn. The sawdust has run out of Caesar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing the end of the Sawdust Caesar, Benito Mussolini. The clip you just heard was from a 1945 Universal newsreel that announced the death of the Italian dictator. If you've never seen video of the scene I'm about to describe, you can go on YouTube, you can find it, but it's pretty gruesome. The backstory to this event that I'm going to describe starts on April 28th, 1945. Basically, Benito Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, they were trying to flee north. They were trying to sort of set up an Italian resistance movement in the Alps, but they were captured by a group of Italian partisans. Those partisans would then execute both of them, and the following morning, their bodies were taken to Milan. Now, Milan, if you haven't listened to earlier episodes in the series, Milan was basically one of the main centers of Italian fascism, very important location in the early 1920s. So they take these bodies to Milan, and they dump them in the Piazzale Loreto. And this Piazzale is not just another square, but it happens to be where German soldiers had just shot 15 partisans about 9 months earlier. As the dawn breaks, people start to see these bodies, they realize it's Mussolini, and a crowd of angry Italian civilians will gather, and they will start interacting with the bodies. And when I say interacting, I mean in a very kind of physical way. They start spitting at them, they start kicking them. Some people actually bring revolvers, pull out and they shoot the dead body. Can you imagine how much anger you must have had towards someone like Benito Mussolini to think, here's the dead body, I'm going to bring a gun and shoot it some more? But the crowd starts to get kind of unruly, starts to get violent, and eventually they have to call in the local civil policeman. There's actually, you can see this if you go and watch the newsreel that I used for the intro section, they are using a water cannon to tame the crowd to try to protect these bodies, not because they care so much about Benito Mussolini, but because they are trying to just keep order in some way. Eventually, because they know so many people want to see the bodies, they decide, okay, let's string them up. They basically hang them upside down from a nearby garage. They tie a rope around their ankles, they hang them upside down. People can continue to abuse the bodies, but at least they can shuffle by. They can see from far away. Now, adding to all this, they happen to have captured one of Mussolini's key henchmen, a guy named Achille Starace, and they force him to watch as they abuse these bodies, as they kind of, again, signal to him the violence, the anger, the frustration. And then they shoot him too, and they string him alongside his former master. We start by talking about this orgy of violence, in part because it is wages, if you will. It is the end result of 2 decades of fascist rule in Italy. Fascism in Italy doesn't end just with the fact that they lose the war, that the Allies occupy Rome, that they defeat the fascists. But it ends with the almost total rejection of fascism by the Italians themselves. This visceral hatred for Mussolini, this idea that, far from taking us to a sort of glorious triumph, it has led to the total defeat of Italy. Not only, by the way, by the Allies, but also by the Germans. And we'll talk about this more in a second, but basically the Germans in the fall of 1943, they basically decided to fight against the Italians. And we'll get into this more later in the podcast. But in this moment, in this demonstration in the Piazzale Loreto, we are talking about more than just an emotional reaction to fascism. Rather, it might be more useful for you to think of this as a scene from a ritual in which the Italian people spiritually exercised the ideal of Mussolini, the ideal of fascism. All this kicking and spitting and shooting, it was meant to desacralize the body of the Duce, right? At one point we mentioned if you were using pronouns to talk about Mussolini, they had to be capitalized because they were trying to say this man is almost godlike in his significance, in his importance, in his command of events and of this kind of world historical moment. And so in 1945, we have almost the opposite of that, right? We have to show that we don't care anything at all, that this man, his humanity doesn't even matter. His mistress doesn't matter, right? The whole system was so bad, was so awful that we want to ritually perform that and show everyone else in Italy how much we no longer believe in fascism. So how we got to this point, not only how Mussolini fell, but again, how did it get to be a point where he was just, again, abused and spat at and hated by the same crowds that had cheered for him 10 to 20 years before? How this happens is going to be the subject of today's episode. Now, just briefly before we get into the history, I do want to add a kind of special kind of note to the program today. Usually when we talk about these events, when we talk about World War II especially, we're going to get into Nazism in future episodes. This is a very heavy subject. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of destruction. It's tragic. And there are elements of that in this story as well. Don't get me wrong. But in discussing particularly the fall of Benito Mussolini, there is also kind of a dark comedic aspect to the story that I'm going to highlight. If you ever saw the movie The Death of Stalin that came out a couple years ago, it's similar in some ways to that, right? Where there's a kind of wry humor to it. There's a lot of people just making incredibly stupid decisions, doing kind of like smack your head moments, like, what? What on earth are these people thinking? So again, even though it's a dark story, it's a tragic story, there's also this kind of comedic side to it that I really want to highlight and bring out in a way that we don't usually do on this program. So let's get started by talking about the history and specifically this moment where Benito Mussolini falls in the summer of 1943. To reset the story for you a little bit, by this point, again, it had become pretty obvious to most Italians that the war was lost or that it was likely going to be lost. Italians had already suffered through several kind of disastrous invasions on their own. As we talked about, they don't really do a whole lot in terms of fighting against France. They try to show some initiative in invading Greece, and that doesn't go well. They try to show some initiative in terms of invading Egypt. That doesn't go well. And so even the people that were most optimistic about the course of the war, their faith is less in Italy and in Benito Mussolini than it is in the idea that the Germans are going to win the war and the Italians will just kind of piggyback off of that. But again, the Italian performance in the war is terrible. Another moment we could bring up and have brought up is Stalingrad. When the Soviets counterattack at Stalingrad, the initial attack, the initial movement to encircle the German Sixth Army, that's directed against the Italians and some of the other satellite armies. Why do they attack the Italians? Because they know the Italians are not very reliable. By the time you get to January 1943, Tripoli, which is the heart of the Italian colonial possessions in Africa, in January 1943, it falls to the Allies. In May of the same year, Tunis will fall, and this essentially marks the end of the Axis presence in Africa. Finally, the most decisive moment comes on the night of July 9th, 1943, when Allied forces land in Sicily. And the problem is not only that they managed to land there, but when they attack the Italian formations, many of the Italian formations simply surrender or run away. And so from the German perspective, at least, the idea that Italy will be a reliable partner in the war is shattered. For many Italians, it's become very obvious, right? We just want the war to end. What is the quickest way to that? Maybe just surrendering is part of it. Now, as all these events are taking place, Benito Mussolini had been the dictator since 1925. It's pretty clear that he bears responsibility for it. And so many Italians from across the political spectrum will start looking elsewhere. We'll start getting this kind of wandering eye thinking about what are some alternatives out there to Mussolini in terms of political leadership that might be able to save the country. For those who are critical of fascism, the two largest institutions or the two most powerful institutions were the monarchy and the army. Now, the king himself is also one of these people with kind of wandering eyes, but he kind of vacillates back and forth. The king did not want to really be that assertive. He didn't want to involve himself in the day-to-day affairs of state. And so he kind of goes back and forth on whether or not to try to topple Mussolini. We'll see he eventually does get there. But while this is going on, members of his household are openly discussing what might be done, or at least they're not being very careful about these discussions that they're having. There are a variety of anti-fascist conspiracies that are kicked around. Some of these Italians, however, instead of focusing solely on Mussolini, they dream about replacing the king as well. Who was it that made Benito Mussolini prime minister? Who was it that gave support to Mussolini all these years, including when he made himself dictator in 1925? Wasn't it the king? For some Italians, like Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the monarchy was too closely associated to fascism, and his ultimate idea was to get rid of the monarchy. Or at least at one point he discussed this. Of course, what's funny about that is, who is the man that the king appoints to replace Benito Mussolini? Pietro Badoglio. Now, at the other end of the scale, there were other people who thought the problem was, and this is going to sound really weird, but the problem was that Mussolini wasn't fascist enough. That Mussolini wasn't willing to take the decisive steps to stand with the Germans that were necessary in order to win the war. One of the most prominent figures from this camp was a guy named Roberto Farinacci. He had been the party secretary general of the PNF, or the Partito Fascista Nazionale, right, the Italian Fascist Party. This was the general secretary, or former general secretary. And Farinacci wanted to see a kind of secondary revolution, one that would purge the party and the society of all those who were not completely dedicated to the war effort. So far, we've talked about people that looked at fascism and were kind of critical of it. We looked at people that were not just pro-fascism, but thought that the brand under Mussolini wasn't sort of tough enough, wasn't sort of fascist enough. But when you talk about political leaders, there are plenty of them out there that just don't really believe in anything except their own kind of path to power. And so you also had in the Italian context a number of top fascists, right? These are people that believe in fascism, that are deeply involved in the fascist rise to power, in fascist government for 2 decades. But they start to think, well, this Mussolini guy, he's not really being effective anymore. Can we have a kind of palace coup? Can we get rid of Mussolini but keep the fascism? Can we maybe make different decisions about our relationship with Germany, but let's stay in power. Let's keep our kind of authoritarian state. If we're making a list of these figures, we could talk about Giuseppe Bottai. We could talk about the Justice Minister Dino Grandi, and we'll go into a lot more detail about him in a little bit. But again, their kind of critique is less of fascism than it is just kind of Mussolini himself. One of their chief gripes is not necessarily about the war or the treatment of rival parties or, liberal democracy or colonialism or any kind of major political issues. One of their chief gripes is that Mussolini's mistress, Clara Petacci, is able to use her position to win favors for her family and her friends. And so they're kind of anti-corruption, but not anti-corruption as a principle, but just more that they're losing out on some of the corruption, and so they don't like that. Now, Mussolini is aware of almost all of these conversations, maybe not, getting a verbatim transcript of them, but he's pretty aware. Rumors are circulating. People are coming to him saying, Benito, il Duce. They don't call him Benito, but they're coming to him saying, look, we have evidence of this. We have recordings of this. I heard about this conversation the king had with someone. The rumors are out there, but Mussolini, somewhat ironically, decides, I'm not going after these guys with an iron fist. There is no Knight of the Long Knives. He basically will shuffle his cabinet around. He'll take away some power from some of the people that are a little bit more suspect. But there is no crackdown. Again, all of these things come to a head in July 1943 following the Allied landings in Sicily. And again, this is particularly disturbing because, not for the first time, but in a way that is immediately obvious, Italian soldiers are fleeing, they are surrendering, they are showing that they have no will to fight. When this happened in Africa, that was one thing, but now they're in Sicily, they're almost to the Italian mainland. Right, the Italian soldiers should be showing a little bit more spunk, a little bit more elan, if you will. In this environment, the kind of pro-German group led by Farinacci, although to some extent also some of those who were critical of Mussolini's performance, they say, look, we need to kind of rally everybody together. We need to kind of make sure that we're focused here. Let us call a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council, which, if you recall from our last episode, was theoretically the main or supreme legal authority in Italy outside of the king. Now, the Fascist Grand Council doesn't meet a whole lot. In fact, it hasn't met since 1939. And so Mussolini understands this less as a kind of coup attempt than as an opportunity to go out and talk to his fellow fascists and convince them and reassure them of his ability to lead. Another way to think about this potentially is that it was a way for them to air their grievances, which then Mussolini could deal with, he could talk through. And so he goes into this, kind of not understanding the broader significance of it. However, he probably should have, because as we'll see in a minute, it was pretty obvious that there was a sort of palace coup attempt that some of the members were attempting, but we'll get into that in just a second. So to set the stage for this Grand Council meeting, we need to start by talking a little bit more about especially one of the pro-royalist conspirators, Dino Grandi. Grandi was from a moderately prosperous landowning family near Bologna, and he quickly rose up the fascist ranks in the early 1920s. He had served in a variety of roles, including being the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was the ambassador to the United Kingdom for a while, and he had spent most of World War II as the Minister of Justice, which again, in the context of World War II, is not only about petty crime and things like that, but is deeply wrapped up with fascist power, with the war effort, with stamping out dissent. But by 1943, Grandi had become convinced of Mussolini's ineptitude. He kind of begins to urge the king to reassert control over the government. He wants the king to arrest Mussolini and replace him with someone else. But Grandi was also a lawyer by training. And his vision of a coup isn't the kind of caricature that I think a lot of us have, where if you want to carry off a coup, you show up with guns, you arrest the rival leadership, and you just kind of seize power. Instead, Grandi says we have to do this the legal way. We have to follow legal principles, which is a little weird if you think about it, because they're living in a dictatorship. Benito Mussolini was not really bound by law, or at least the theory of his government, the animating spirit of fascism, is to criticize the idea that, well, you have these laws that are written down, they limit potential, they limit the actions of the leader. We don't want that. We need to emancipate the leader in order to be decisive, to take actions. Again, one of their big criticisms of democracy. All you people in democracy do is argue about stuff. You never do anything. We are men of action, they would say. Grandi is not a man of action. And so Grandi's plan is we're going to meet at this Grand Council. He will produce a resolution at the Grand Council calling for the transfer of power back to the king. And the people at the Grand Council will vote on it while Mussolini is there. And just think about that for a minute. You're going to challenge someone with supreme kind of legal authority, someone who could easily have you put to death, and you're going to have a vote. What happens if you lose the vote, right? In the Soviet example, when you have votes in the Politburo, when you have these moments from time to time when they denounce each other, it doesn't end well usually for the loser, right? Getting kicked out of the party, getting demoted from the Politburo, that's actually pretty good. That's the good option. A lot of the people that challenge Stalin end up dead. So Grandi's motion is, in some ways, an enormous gamble. And he's aware of this. So Grandi decides, I've got my draft resolution here. I'm going to start showing it to people on the Fascist Grand Council ahead of time. I'm going to get them to commit to support it. So, kind of like today in modern American politics, they say, never take a bill to the floor in the House of Representatives unless you know you already have the votes to pass it. So he's going around and he starts showing this bill to others. Most of them express some tepid support. Most of them are aware, as I said, that the war is not going well. Most of them would like to see Mussolini replaced. But they don't want to put their necks out for it. So they kind of say, yeah, I'll support it. If everyone else supports it, I'll support it as well. And so again, Grandi is going around looking for support. Now, of course, other people don't necessarily support it. When Farinacci finds out about it, Farinacci's not very happy. He knows what kind of the direction that Grandi wants to pull Italy in terms of the war. And so if you think about it, Grandi is circulating evidence of high treason. He's circulating evidence that he's about to oppose Mussolini. His rivals get it. And one of them, who is the new Fascist Party secretary, a guy named Carlo Scorza actually takes a draft of it and shows it to Mussolini on the 21st, 3 days before the actual meeting of the Fascist Grand Council. Now, again, I said there's kind of a comedic element to this story. Mussolini is tired. Mussolini was dealing with some health issues. Mussolini doesn't really fully read the resolution. Grandi had smartly kind of buried the key point in the resolution all the way at the end to kind of slip it in there. So Mussolini doesn't really do anything, even though Scorza just told him about it. Now, Scorza is also kind of scheming here. Scorza, when Grandi comes to him and says, oh, you have this idea, this resolution, Scorza says, oh, yeah, I'm with you. I totally support you. And then he goes off and he drafts his own rival watered-down resolution, which he kind of plots that once Grandi has stuck his neck out and taken this initiative, Scorza can come back with something a little bit more watered down, a little bit more favorable to Mussolini. And maybe he can kind of steal Grandi's thunder, but not risk himself and expose himself the way that Grandi had. Now, again, there's a comedic element to this, right? If you are Grandi and you are showing everyone this evidence that you're going to try to throw over Mussolini, who's probably the last person that you would want to go and show the resolution to? Benito Mussolini, right? What does Grandi do? On the 22nd, he makes an appointment, he sits down, and he reads his resolution to Mussolini himself. And then he makes a speech to Mussolini about why this is the best path forward. Now, in his mind, he was probably trying to get Mussolini to accept it in advance. But as you can imagine, Mussolini doesn't just go, oh, you're right. I've worked all these years to become dictator. I've worked all these years to become Il Duce, but you showed me a resolution, so I quit. Mussolini actually doesn't really say a whole lot to him. As I said, Mussolini wasn't feeling particularly well. He dealt with ulcers a lot, especially by this point. And so he just lets Grandi go. Grandi leaves. He meets the next day with a guy named Count Ciano, who happens to be another high-ranking fascist official, who also happens to be married to Mussolini's daughter. So he's Mussolini's son-in-law. Ciano also sort of expresses tepid support, which again is kind of a weird thing if you think about, like, you know, would you go and support overthrowing your father-in-law? So when they finally have this meeting on the night of July 24th, 1943, it's this kind of absurd comedy. It's all these people with agendas and resolutions, and they're all kind of trying to double-cross each other, but they're all being kind of very open about a lot of this. And so, as I said, they meet on the night of July 24th at the Palazzo Venezia for this meeting. The meeting starts out with Mussolini trying to kind of mount a defense of his rule and to sort of update them on the war, but more to update them on the war in a way that defends his own actions and provides excuses as to why everything is everyone else's fault. And so basically he goes on for 2 hours. He whines about the generals who had misinformed him. Of course, if you have listened to our last episode, actually a lot of the generals said, Mussolini, let's not do this. And Mussolini said, do it anyways. He whines about the soldiers, who he claims are cowards that often surrender at first contact. He whines about the people, whose hearts had never really been in the war to begin with. Ironically, the one group that he defends in this speech is the Germans, who privately he's complained about for years. When World War II is going on and the Germans actually start to experience some setbacks in Operation Barbarossa, Mussolini gets excited about it. He's actually kind of happy about it. The Germans aren't invincible. But during this 2-hour speech, he kind of defends them. Of course, he leaves out Operation Barbarossa in this speech. And so again, he drones on for 2 hours and he ends, well, okay, now we have to decide, are we for war or for peace? Whatever that means. Because Italy wasn't in a place really to make that decision. That was the German call, if you will. So after all this is over, his son-in-law Ciano says he wants the floor. He gets up and he gives this kind of tangential history of the Italian-German alliance. Ciano will be the one arguing that the Germans are responsible for most of Italy's troubles. Of course, this then infuriates Roberto Farinacci, who was again this kind of hardcore Germanophile. Farinacci responds with this kind of defensive speech. The Germans are great. They've done a lot. And then Farinacci pulls out a resolution. Now, Farinacci's resolution called for the king to reassert control over the military. But it was not to try to end the war, but rather Farinacci thought, once the king is in charge of the military, I can kind of convince him to give that power over to the Germans, and in particular to the Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who was the main commander of German forces in Italy at the time. So again, you have coup within coup. Are we overthrowing Mussolini? Are we overthrowing fascism? Are we overthrowing the king? Are we using the Germans to come in and kind of take over everything? It's just a big mess. The meeting would drag on for 7 hours until well past midnight. At one point, Mussolini kind of revives a little bit. He regains his confidence and he starts saying to them, I'm going to execute you. He even says this to his own son-in-law, Ciano, who is participating or at least openly sympathetic towards this idea of replacing him. Now, after all this, Scorza comes back up again. He says, I also have an alternative resolution. I want to transfer military command to Graziani, who was an Italian general that was sympathetic to the German cause. So all these resolutions, it's not hard to imagine, right? If you were making a movie, right? Here's all these old Italian men. It's in the wee hours of the morning. They all kind of are frustrated and bitter towards each other and shouting and insulting each other. Ciano tries to be the deal maker. He says, you know what we can do? We can make a commission, and the commission is going to study and combine the resolutions, and then we can vote on them. Which again, you're in the middle of a coup. You're trying to overthrow Mussolini, in essence, to say, well, let's interrupt our coup for a blue ribbon commission to study the best way to overthrow Mussolini. It's absurd. Finally, at 2:15 in the morning, Mussolini gives up and he says, we're going to have a vote. And he says, the first guy that we're going to vote on is Grandi's motion. Now, why he allowed Grandi's motion to go first, I don't know. You would think in some ways that this was the most radical of the resolutions, so maybe you would want to do that last. Let some of the more supportive members of the Fascist Party vote first. Grandi's motion will pass with 19 votes. In a way, it marked the moment of Mussolini's fall. The thing is, this Fascist Ground Council, the kind of legal trappings that it works under, a lot of this had existed in theory but never been tested out. A lot of the theory may have been window dressing to begin with in the first place because, again, fascists are supposed to be men of action. They're not men of law or men of discourse. And so even after they have this vote, it's not clear what it means. The following morning, most of the people involved in it just act like nothing had really changed. Mussolini does not move to arrest the people that voted for the resolution. He doesn't go after Grandi. Grandi himself doesn't go to the people and say, look, we have this, resolution. He doesn't go to the army and try to get them to arrest Mussolini. They just kind of, again, act like nothing's happened. Mussolini even has meetings the next day with people that were at the meeting that voted against him. And it's, oh, hi, how are you doing? Oh, good. Late night last night? Yeah. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, of course. At 5 o'clock the following day, Mussolini goes to meet with the king, as was his usual custom. Now, again, some of Mussolini's closer people, his wife, for example, they say, don't trust the king. There are all these rumors. This could be a trap. Obviously, you just had this vote, right? That people do want to get rid of you inside the fascist party. Mussolini's like, it's not a big deal. The king supports me. I can talk him out of anything that, he's decided that I don't like. So he goes to the meeting. Now, here, as they say, is where the worm actually turned, because despite kind of waffling for a while about what to do, by this point, the king had decided to arrest Mussolini, and having the legal cover of the council vote prompts him into action. The king, after hearing of the vote, goes to Marshal Badoglio, and he says, I want you to be the next head of government, and Badoglio agrees. He then speaks with General Syriza, who was the head of the Carabinieri, or the National Police Force. Syriza was ordered to arrest Mussolini after his audience with the king. And this is basically what happens. Mussolini shows up. He thinks it's going to be a friendly meeting, makes his big speech about why the council resolution doesn't matter. And the king kind of says, it's too late, Benito. Everybody's kind of lost confidence in you, the people, the army. And Mussolini responds by sort of suggesting, well, should I just resign then? The king is like, yeah, you should. And so Mussolini leaves kind of being deflated, being surprised, being overwhelmed. On his way out, he's met by a captain in the Carabinieri. The captain says, Mussolini, I've got to escort you. He says, okay, fine, let's get into my limo. Captain says, actually, we need to go in my vehicle. I've got orders. I can't take no for an answer. And so Mussolini goes along with him. He just basically surrenders. Now, again, just stepping back a little bit, right? We've talked about this fall of the great dictator. What strikes me is so, again, kind of ironic, comical, hilarious in some ways, is that you have overthrown a dictator, you've overthrown fascism through these kind of arcane legal ways, through a resolution. Now, the immediate public reaction to Mussolini's fall is pretty much shock, right? Mussolini had been dictator, and in dictatorships, one of the rules of thumb for dictatorship is you never want to sort of promote the alternative, the guy who could replace you, because when you do, a lot of times that happens. And so there wasn't a clear sense of, okay, who comes after Mussolini in terms of succession? And while many Italians were aware that they were losing the war, they thought they were going to lose the war, there's not a whole lot in the public eye where people are openly criticizing Mussolini or calling on him to step down. It's a fascist society. You don't have freedom of speech. You can't do that. By 1943, Mussolini had been the leader of Italy for over 20 years, an explicitly dictator for most of them. In propaganda terms, he was a world historical figure who was going to lead Italy to glory. How can you follow that up? How can you just say, oh, I'm going to replace that guy? And so really, a lot of people on the ground are unprepared for this moment. There is a little bit of violence against some of the fascist leaders. Primarily, the main kind of action is to sack or occupy local fascist party headquarters or offices. But there isn't an infrastructure willing to step in and immediately replace Mussolini, at least not one that is ready to carry out a Bolshevik-style revolution. Now, the PNF also struggles to respond to this. The PNF, it's not that Mussolini was overthrown by socialists or communists. The PNF is overthrown by itself, or at least Mussolini is overthrown by the party itself, right? So it can't attack itself. The only real institutional structure left is the king, and the king confers that authority to Badoglio, and Badoglio does take some actions to kind of take apart the party. The Fascist Grand Council, having fulfilled its objective, is dissolved. The party, the PNF, is dissolved. The fascist organs of state are mainly dissolved. This revolution, however, only goes so far. And it does not address the kind of elephant in the room, which is the reason that Mussolini fell in the first place. And that is the war. It was pretty obvious to most of the people in Italy and around Europe. It is very obvious to the Germans, even before any of this begins, going back to the start of 1943. It is obvious to the Germans that there is the potential for Italy to withdraw from the war, or even worse, to try to switch sides. And so they are already, before the summer of 1943, developing plans to try to attack or occupy mainland Italy. They are already moving troops down into Italy, not to fight the Allies, but with an eye towards how do we secure Rome? How do we secure various cities, various defensive positions, various military bases? Nevertheless, Badoglio's government, instead of just kind of saying, okay, we're pulling out of the war, we don't want to be involved anymore, they try to play this sort of game where they're going to placate the Germans, they're going to pretend loyalty, they're going to profess loyalty, they're going to talk about how much they need the Germans to come down and fight the Allies. But at the same time, they're negotiating with the Allies about withdrawing from the war. In practice, this gets really weird. Hey, Germany, we'd love you to send down a couple of divisions. Just make sure you send them down to the Naples area so they can fight against the Allies. And the Germans are like, well, we'll move some down there, but we also want to keep some in northern Italy, just as a kind of strategic reserve, wink, wink. And the Italians are like, well, we don't really want them in northern Italy. Let's put them down on the front. Let's put them where, hey, the Allies, if we surrender, the Allies can just surround them and cut them off. And so you have this kind of frenemy-like relationship for a couple weeks where it's pretty obvious what the Italians are trying to do, but they're not being explicit about it. And the Germans are pretending like they're not picking up on what's really happening, even though they are. And so you have this kind of, again, cloak and dagger, this movement in the shadows, this crazy game of sort of almost like poker that all comes to a head in early September. On September 3rd, 1943, Italian negotiators secretly signed a surrender agreement, but it's supposed to be secret for about 2 weeks. And these 2 weeks will allow them to reposition troops, to prepare for the German attack. Only the Allies kind of screw it up. The Allies want to kind of push forward. They want the Italians out of the war earlier so they can start to move into southern Italy. And so on September 8th, Dwight Eisenhower announces on the radio that the Italians had surrendered. And Badoglio will go on the radio that night and say, actually, that's true, we have surrendered. But again, this proves disastrous, and it's almost comedically bad in terms of how stupid or the lack of foresight that Badoglio had. In the 6 weeks between Mussolini's fall and the signing of the armistice, the Germans had reassigned 8 divisions from other parts of Europe to Italian soil. And these units position themselves in such a way that they are ready to attack or seize control of Italy as opposed to defending it against the Allies. When Italy does finally surrender, on September 8th and in the morning of September 9th, German forces launch a well-coordinated and prepared offensive against their Italian allies. It was codenamed Operation Achse, and again, it featured German units seizing control over many strategic positions. Basically, they will turn their guns on Italians and say, surrender or else. In most cases, the Italians, they didn't want to fight the Allies. They didn't want to fight the Germans either. So in most cases, these Italian troops surrender. In some cases, they do fight back. There are some battles. There will be some Italian casualties. But as you can imagine, the Italian will to fight wasn't very strong. There hadn't been a lot of preparation for this sudden about-face. And, now we're going to fight our allies that we were just saying were here to protect us, that we were so grateful to. The strongest concentration of Italian forces was around the city of Rome, for obvious reasons. They last for about 24 hours. On September 10th, 2 days after the first sort of surrender, the city of Rome falls to the German forces, and by the 15th, so about a week after all this began, all non-collaborationist Italian forces in Italy had been disarmed. Now, there were some units that surrendered and basically said, look, we want to fight with you guys. We still are on the side of the Axis, and those units were then reconstituted fairly quickly. But again, the collapse of Italy was swift and it was stunning. Over 20,000 Italian soldiers died in the fighting, and more than 700,000 would be taken prisoner and sent to Germany, or about 50,000 will die in concentration camps, POW camps, in the German war industries. In essence, the conspirators from July 24th, 1943, they succeeded in bringing down Mussolini, but they provide little to replace him. And as a result, both Mussolini and Italian fascism would soon be revived. Now, as we mentioned, the Germans seized control of most of Italy in the matter of a week in September 1943. But to occupy another country is expensive. To occupy another country takes manpower, takes willpower, takes time and effort. And in the middle of World War II, the last thing that the Germans had available was extra manpower, extra resources. Right? They don't really want to be ruling Italy. There are a lot of places they did want to conquer and rule. Most of Italy is not part of it. And so it seems very obvious, literally from day one, to Hitler that the goal here has to be to restore Mussolini to power. How much of this is this idea that they had this eternal friendship? Right? Hitler professes this later on. Whether or not that was actually the case versus how much Hitler just said, I can rely on Mussolini. I need Mussolini to kind of give some sort of public face. He's my Quisling, for those of you that are familiar with Norwegian history. But basically, Hitler decides that the fastest way to get Italy back where he wants it is to get Mussolini back in power. And so the day after his arrest, he orders a young Austrian captain named Otto Skorzeny, who was from a special Waffen-SS unit. The Waffen-SS, we haven't had a chance to talk about those. They are basically part of a German Nazi paramilitary group. They were well armed. The Waffen-SS tended to fight more like soldiers than the broader part of the SS itself. All of that lies for kind of future podcasts to talk about. For now, what's important is that Skorzeny was charged with this idea of capturing Mussolini. And here again, we get to the kind of comedic side of the story, right? It's still tragic, but there are parts of it that are just downright funny to my mind. Badoglio's Italian government was aware that Mussolini was a valuable sort of prisoner. They were not prepared to execute him, but they also did not want him to fall into German hands because they knew what might happen. So basically, they're going to try to move Mussolini around from place to place while he's sort of under arrest. So how can Skorzeny track down where the Duce is? The first time that they find him, it is almost through a game of telephone. You guys remember telephone where you hear that someone said something and someone said something else? This is basically what happens. There's a guy who eats at the same restaurant as Skorzeny who comes in and he says, I heard a rumor from a man who lives on the coast between Rome and Naples, who heard from his maid, who heard it from her lover, who was in the Carbonari, which is like an Italian police force, that there was an important prisoner being held in the area. Skorzeny says, I'm not going to leave any stone unturned. I've been personally charged by the Fuhrer to kind of carry this mission out. So it takes him a couple days, but they confirm that this is indeed Mussolini in this prison. So they start planning the rescue operation. They start, you think about the scene in the movie, right? The guys are all running out and they start the engines on the aircraft and they're waiting to load the people in and they're getting ready to go and it's almost go hour. And then they find he just got moved the night before. Takes a couple days. The Germans keep looking for him. They think this time that they found him on a small island off the coast of Sardinia. They want to verify this, though, because you don't want to just send your commandos around and ruin the element of surprise. So they tell their agents, go into the local bars that the fishermen hang out in, drink with them, get to know them, be buddy-buddy, have the conversation, turn around to Mussolini, and then swear that you know he's dead. And at this point, if he's there, the fishermen will say, no, he's alive. And then you bet, no, I bet he's dead, and I'm going to put some money on it. You prove to me that he's alive, and you'll win the bet, and you'll get the money. So this actually is what they do, and it works. And they find Mussolini, and then he's moved again. So the third and final time that the Germans find him, they do it more the kind of new-fashioned way. Basically, they intercept Italian communications. The Italians are talking about security measures being completed at a hotel complex called Gran Sasso. They send a doctor to investigate. The doctor says, I'm here and I want to be able to transfer large numbers of German troops here that are wounded. I need to do some investigating. Will the facilities work? And basically the Italian security says, absolutely not. You cannot enter this hotel. So on September 12, 1943, the Germans actually launched their rescue mission. They will come in on these gliders. They actually do something fairly clever. They also bring with them an Italian general who was sympathetic to the German cause. And so when the guards are there, it's one thing to shoot at Germans, but they literally pull the Italian general off and they say, here's General so-and-so. And the guys that are there are like, well, I don't want to shoot at my own countrymen. And so they never open fire to try to defend or to keep Mussolini. He and Skorzeny get into this kind of small, very overloaded plane. Again, the comedy potential of this is, insane. It's off the charts. The plane is overweight. They're like, Skorzeny, get out of the plane. It's just going to be me and Mussolini. And Skorzeny's like, no, this was my operation. I have to be there. If it fails, I'm answerable to it. We're all getting in the plane, whether we die or not. Who knows? So they get in the plane. They fly to Vienna. They land. They're safe. And then 2 days later, Mussolini is flown to Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, Prussia, where he was proclaimed as the leader of the new Italian Social Republic, which is more commonly known as the Republic of Salo. Now, at a practical level, the Republic of Salo was really nothing more than a German puppet state. By October of 1943, most Italian territory has come under direct German military control. And the question of Italian governance is, you could say it's irrelevant or it's kind of farcical, right? The Germans call the shots. And the Italians under this government of Salo will do whatever the Germans kind of tell them to do. In a theoretical way, though, the question of the nature of the Italian Republic matters because you're trying to win the loyalty of the population, trying to get them to cooperate, pay taxes, to fight against the Allies. And so to make it seem more legitimate, to make it seem more real, Mussolini's new government is portrayed basically as a second fascist revolution. The idea is that the first revolution, while it seized power, it never really displaced some of the older institutions or individuals who were part of the kind of liberal, democratic, bourgeois past. And so the remaining fascists begin to develop this idea of, let's take fascism back to our roots. Let's get back into the kind of class element of fascism. As you know, many fascists came originally from a sort of socialist background or were socialist friendly, right? And then they discard that after they get into power in the run-up to the seizure of power. But this idea of let's have a secondary fascist revolution says, let's go back to being who we were in 1919 when we embraced some of those more radical ideals. They rename the Italian state the Italian Social Republic, and they rename the fascist party the Republican Fascist Party. The idea here, again, is to sort of create a kind of class element, to reinsert or reignite kind of revolutionary fervor among the masses. To send a message about this idea of change, they also try 16 of the council members who had voted to depose Mussolini. Now, they only have 6 of them under control, the most prominent of which was Ciano. But they conduct this trial. They try to make Ciano seem more like a wealthy guy, a privileged guy, a bourgeois guy. And so they execute these 6 guys in January 1944. Another key name that was in this group that was captured was Marshal de Bono, who was one of the key leaders of fascism in the early 1920s, had been one of the leaders of the March on Rome, was decorated with special medals because of it. But they execute him in January 1944. Now, despite these claims of trying to, have a second fascist revolution, in reality, there is little fire beneath it, right? This is more like a rebranding effort. KFC used to be called Kentucky Fried Chicken, and then they changed it to KFC because they want to offer more than chicken. But it's still about Kentucky Fried Chicken and Colonel Sanders and all that, right? It doesn't really change a lot of what's actually there. This new revised Republican Fascist Party does attract some new members, but it never really builds an independent government. It never produces a constitution. Most of its financing comes directly from Berlin. Nor were the promised economic reforms ever really carried out. Instead, the government's most important achievement was simply to continue the war. And here, the most important thing was actually trying to suppress the actions of its own people. One of the things that happens across World War II is the more and more people become convinced that the Germans are going to lose the war, the more and more people will join resistance movements. If you go back and you look at the history in 1942, there are not a lot of vibrant resistance movements going on in continental Europe. The French resistance isn't that big. It's not that active. Right? The one asterisk to this, or two, would be Yugoslavia, and the other would be in the Soviet Union, right, where the people are fighting behind the lines and on the front lines as well. But as the Axis begin to lose the war in more and more obvious ways in 1944, more and more people, whether it's because they're no longer as afraid, whether it's because they think this is a moment that yeah, I might die, but at least if I die, I'm making a sacrifice that matters. This could actually help defeat Germany, whereas in 1942, that wasn't the case. But for whatever reason, you have all of these local resistance movements, all of these partisans springing up in France, in Italy, in other parts of Europe. Now, in the Italian context, this is usually led by socialists or communists, and they will set up local committees of national liberation. They will begin to employ the type of insurgent tactics that we've seen already going back in the 1920s and 30s, and that we can carry up all the way down to the present day. We're talking about assassinations of not just German political leaders, but also of German troops or German auxiliary troops, right? Allied troops fighting with the Germans. You have things like sabotage, blowing up rail lines, bridges, factories. And so in response to this, Mussolini begins to organize his own kind of new paramilitary group in order to coordinate at first the protection of key officials of the Republic of Salo, and then later to carry on a kind of broader counterinsurgency program. Now, the first one of these was formed in June of 1944, and it was known as the Brigate Nera, or the Black Brigades. And these became the principal agents of a smoldering civil war that took place in Italy for about the course of a year. Now, these Brigate Nera are not, when we think of most combat units, we think about young men. They're somewhere between 20 and 30, maybe even up to 40. These Brigate Nera are not the creme de la creme, if you will, of the Italian fighting force, which was never that impressive to begin with. Many of these recruits are old veteran squadrists. So these are people that enjoyed basically carrying the fight to the communists and the socialists in the 19-teens and early 1920s, right before the revolution really even gets underway under Mussolini. And for some of them, 1944 is a chance to relive their glory days. Right? They want to get back into the action. Some of these guys are a little on the young side. Many of them are not well equipped. Right? They have small arms, but it's not like they have tanks or heavy artillery or something like that. Very, very few of them will see action against the Allies. They're just not reliable enough to throw into that type of combat situation. And so as a result, as I said, they end up doing this kind of counterinsurgency, but against their own people. Right? These are Italians going against Italians. One of the things that they get wrapped up in terms of counterinsurgency, is the idea of reprisal actions. Reprisal action means when someone assassinates one of your people or kills one of your people, you kill 10 of theirs, usually civilians, usually people that can't defend themselves. The idea being, it's one thing for you to think, I care about liberty, justice, whatever. I will be willing to sacrifice my life for the cause. A lot of people, or at least a significant number of people in history that feel that way, that are willing to do that. But am I willing to risk the lives of 10 people from my village who may or may not have made that decision? That's a lot harder. Am I willing to risk the lives of a 10-year-old boy who hasn't had his chance to decide what he wants to do with his life? Does he want to risk it? Does he want to take care of his sister? How do I, from a moral standpoint, take that risk on their behalf? This is why counterinsurgents sometimes develop these kind of very harsh tactics. Basically, to make a long story short, in Italy, starting in the summer of 1944, you start to have this give and take between partisans and between some of these Brigate Nera, and especially the German occupiers, that lead to massacres. In March of 1944, for example, there is a partisan attack in central Rome, and they will kill 33 order police. Now, ironically, these order police are supposed to be Germans, but they're drawn from kind of northern Italy, or what the Germans were considering at that point kind of southern Germany. And so many of them are ethnically Italian, but they're killed by these partisans, 33 of them. In response to this, Germans will bring 335 prisoners to the Ardeatine Caves on the outskirts of Rome, This is where the early Christians had buried a number of their martyrs, and the Germans shoot all 335 of them at point-blank range, many of them with their hands bound. They then use dynamite to blow up the entrance to the tunnels, to seal it, and kind of hide what they've done. Another example comes from about 5 or 6 months later, August 12, 1944. This is at San Anna di Stazzema in Tuscany. You have members of the Waffen-SS working with the Brigate Nera, and they murder over 500 civilians, including 100 children, again shooting them at point-blank range. Again, to kind of both hide evidence of their crime or possibly to even send a kind of bigger signal, they then burn the village to the ground, trying to kind of, again, tell partisans, these are the costs that your people will pay for these activities, right? Trying to dissuade them from trying to fight. These types of actions are not unique to the Italian context, but they are the type of intense, local, brutal fighting that continues in many countries until the end of the war. The reprisal actions in the end actually proved to be quite unsuccessful. In fact, one could argue that they actually swelled the ranks of the resistance movements and fed this kind of increasing desire, frustration, hostility to fascism in general and the people that supported it. Okay, to finish the story of the war, Allied progress after the landings in September 1943 were extraordinarily slow. The Germans formed several defensive lines across the Italian peninsula, and these proved actually quite difficult for the Allied armies to break through. The most important of these centered around the medieval abbey at Monte Cassino, which had been founded in the early 6th century and was very close to the line of defense called the Gustav Line that kind of protected the city of Rome. From January to May 1944, the Allies would make several efforts to break through this line, only to suffer high casualties. Eventually, of course, they would break through, and they would take Rome in early June. But the Germans were basically able to fall back again and again on these kind of pre-prepared defensive lines, at least until the late spring of 1945, when everything began to kind of fall apart. By April 1945, not only was it clear that Germany would lose the war, but the basic German control over northern Italy itself began to collapse. Mussolini retreated to Milan on April 19th in the hopes of organizing some kind of Alpine resistance. Mussolini was broadly aware that the Germans had some kind of secret weapon that they were working on. The Germans called it the Wunderwaffe, or the miracle weapon. This was basically the idea of the nuclear bomb. The Germans, of course, never finished it, but the idea was if you could halt the Allied drive long enough, then maybe you could build that bomb and use it. On the 25th of April, he departed for Como, near the Swiss border. And basically, as he kept trying to move farther and farther north, his forces disintegrate. Even the most hardcore, loyal soldiers begin to just give up. Even the Germans. So Mussolini is actually being protected by several Germans. This final moment, he's in a kind of convoy with a bunch of Germans. They're trying to get back to Germany, and the partisans kind of surround them and sort of say, we don't really care about the Germans. We don't really want to fight the Germans anymore. If you guys want to go back to Germany, you're more than welcome to. But any of the former fascists that are from Italy, they have to stay here. We want to have a reckoning with them. And so they actually dress Mussolini up in a German helmet and German coat, and they try to sneak him through, but of course he's recognized. This all happens on April 27th. The partisans kind of put him in a house for a night, and early the next morning, of course, they will shoot him. They then take him to the Piazzale Loreto, where, as we started with our story, then the crowd gathers and starts kind of abusing his body, as well as that of Clara Petacci. In the end, as we walk through this history of fascist Italy, especially this latter part, 1943 to 1945, I'm struck by two things. The first is one that we talked about again at the end of our last episode, this idea of the impotence of Italian fascism, which, as we already discussed, it's not so much that Italian fascism is beaten. It's not quite like the German variant where the Allied armies have to come in and crush it. And there's lots of battles and, Berlin takes like hundreds of thousands of shells in the last week of the war and is almost totally destroyed. Italian fascism basically collapses under the pressure of the war. Benito Mussolini does not end up, in some kind of bunker fighting to the last man. He's not like Napoleon, where at least, he has this marshaling of forces and, there is a big decisive battle and, maybe there's a kind of heroic element to it if you look at it in the right way, perhaps. Instead, Mussolini ends up basically, as I said, as another Quisling, as a kind of two-bit politician, a guy who's going to sell out the interests of his people just for the title, just for the power, just for the name, because there really isn't any power. Mussolini doesn't end up having much influence on the Germans, even as they occupy his country. He ends up basically being almost like an administrator, a bureaucrat, a yes man, a dog, if you will, in some ways, right? Someone who has not just very little agency, but no agency. It's the complete antithesis of what fascism claimed it was supposed to be and was supposed to be creating. To be compared to Mussolini today in Italy is an insult. But it's not the same way of insulting someone as calling them Hitler. We see, people have elections all the time. People love to call the people they don't like Hitler. Hitler at least had some degree of power. Hitler, at least at a certain level, is seen as a monster. And monsters are powerful. They're dangerous. We don't like them. We want to eliminate them or we want to stop them. But at least there is a kind of power that they acquire. They're worthy of being our adversaries. Same could be said about Joseph Stalin, right? Vladimir Lenin. Many, many figures in history we could attach this to. Mussolini, on the other hand, ends with being called, as we saw in the Universal reel, the Sawdust Caesar. He strikes us today as more of an absurdity, as more of a joke. To be called Mussolini is not to be called someone that we should all be afraid of today, by and large. It's to be called someone who, again, is kind of incompetent. And that's a pretty damning judgment of fascism, if you think about it. And this brings me to my second point, which is that despite the fact that Mussolini has in many ways become what we might call the biggest loser, or the ultimate loser, it shouldn't distract us from the immense cost that the Italian people had to pay for his rule. Over 300,000 Italian soldiers died during the course of the Second World War, along with about 150,000 civilians. The collapse of the fascist state in 1943 essentially led to, as we said, this bitter civil war, this neighbor against neighbor episode of cyclical violence, where Italians committed atrocities and war crimes against their own fellow Italians. Making this even worse, they usually did this on behalf of the Germans, who didn't really care at all about the Italians, who abused the Italians, not just in Italy proper, but think about, as we mentioned, all those hundreds of thousands of Italian POWs that were sent back to Germany who worked in the war industries and of whom 50,000 would die. Now, Italians have moved on from these conflicts probably more successfully than certain other contexts, especially ones like the former Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia today, where people still are upset about the politics of memory of World War II. And that's even after they have another set of wars in the 1990s to get upset about and to remember and to have this kind of difficult past. But even in Italy, these costs, these wounds, these scars of war still exist. In the end, what more can one say about fascism other than to conclude that it simply does not work? Now, as someone who grew up in the 1980s, who remembers hearing stories from World War II veterans, we talked about the memory, we watched movies about it, the idea that fascism, not just that it was wrong from a moral standpoint, but that it's basically doesn't work, that it's ineffective, that seemed like something that was self-obvious. Perhaps this may be lost on today's generations. Like you, I read the news, and I'm disturbed by the number of people globally who we might describe as fascist curious. Now, perhaps they might prefer a more subtle version of fascism than what we saw in the 1930s. Maybe we don't need the big parades. Maybe we don't need everyone wearing a military uniform. Certainly, very few people would say, oh, we need something like the Holocaust, which we'll get into again in a future episode. But basically, this longing for a strongman, for a world historical figure who is going to bring order to the chaos of the modern world, is one that is still with us. And one can obviously critique these movements by the ways in which they would restrict or redefine the idea of freedom that is so cherished and celebrated by liberal democratic societies, especially the freedom to think differently than the government or the leader. But I think it's equally important to keep in mind the example of Benito Mussolini, who mastered the media, he mastered spectacle and speech, and he built a movement, and he became incredibly powerful politically speaking. Yet when push came to shove, this power was not enough to overcome the forces of history. National glory is not something secured by rhetoric. It is not secured by marches, by propaganda, or, I would argue, by the sheer will to power that men like Mussolini and Hitler and people that are not fascist also we could put in that category. This is something that we should keep in mind as well when we talk about Mussolini's ideological descendants. This is something that I would stress again and again. The legacy of fascism is not only war and violence and the Holocaust, it is also impotence. It is also its inability to control the forces of history that it purports to be able to do. Okay, I will get down off my soapbox. That's going to be it for today. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving a review for us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or post about us on your social media. If you'd like to see an overview of all our episodes on modern European history, we also have a special series on Israel-Palestine, an episode about the historical origins of the war in Ukraine with Russia right now, on Christmas, lots of other things. If you want to find out about all of our episodes, you can find that on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. Once again, that's www.historyoffthepage.com. Thanks again for listening, and hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.